The Scott Henry Training System for Grapevines, Grape Video number 9. This presentation assumes a familiarity with the grapevine terminology presented in Grape Videos 1 through 5. Our story of the Scott Henry Training System for Grapevines begins with Mr. Scott Henry III in a vineyard in Oregon on a Sunday afternoon on August 7th, 1994. This is Mr. Scott Henry on that lovely afternoon when he was so gracious to host me and show me the particular details of the grapevine training system that he invented. Mr. Scott Henry had been an aeronautical engineer and then changed his life in about 1978 when he began planting grapevines and establishing a winery in the Umpqua Valley in Oregon. Scott Henry could not have foreseen the challenges that lay ahead of him when he began planting vines in about 1978 in the rich, fertile valley bottom of the Umpqua Valley immediately adjacent to the Umpqua River. What happened was that as he began to grow his vines on the mid-wire cordon or VSP training system, they grew and grew and grew so that he developed extremely large vines that were not controllable with the mid-wire cordon training system. This rather poor quality photo that I took in 1994 shows growth growing up the trellis, out of the trellis, across the rows, so that there was so much vigor in these vines that Scott Henry decided he needed to do something different to get these vines under control. And that leads us to the start of our discussion of the Scott Henry training system, because it was born out of the necessity to control excessively large vine size. And the principal advantage is that the Scott Henry training system is very suitable for large vines. After I learned from Scott Henry the particulars of his training system, I returned to Michigan to begin to apply his training system to excessively vigorous grapevines such as this Cabernet Franc vineyard in Michigan. The advantages of the Scott Henry training system are directly related to its rather unique structure in that it creates a divided canopy without the complexity of a three-dimensional trellis. And by that we mean that other training systems have divided canopies, more than one canopy going down the row of a vineyard, but they typically divide the canopy horizontally into training systems like Geneva Double Curtain or Lyre, and we will look at those later. But this Scott Henry training system divides the canopy, as we will see, vertically, and this makes for a very workable system, and it does lead to a promotion of vine balance with large vines. Why? Because we can display well twice the number of shoots per foot of trellis than with a more conventional system. And here's what it looks like in the dormant period. These are white Riesling grapevines at the Southwest Michigan Research and Extension Center, and we applied the Scott Henry training system to these vines. And as a starting point, you can see that from the middle of the trellis we had shoots going upward and we had shoots going downward from two different cordon situations, and this creates a vertically divided canopy, an upper part of the canopy and a lower part divided in the middle of the trellis. Here's what it looks like during the growing season, and you can see the upward and downward placement of the shoots. There are about 3 canes right in the middle of the vine here that come from the lower portion of the vine and are allowed to extend up through that window in the middle of the trellis. And the reason for that is that those are options for the future placement of canes on that lower fruiting wire, and we're allowing strong canes to develop right in the middle for replacement of fruiting wood in the next year on the lower part of the trellis. And by placing shoots upward and downward from a middle portion of the trellis, the Scott Henry training system wonderfully can display a large canopy, a large foliage on the trellis without shading the fruit because of that shoot positioning both upwards and downwards. Here's a schematic that shows that attribute of the Scott Henry training system, so that sun in the morning, sun in the afternoon can reach all the clusters in the fruit zone well, because the canopy, the leaf area, has been positioned up and away and down and away from the fruit zone. And here it is again in the vineyard. This is really one of the shining attributes of Scott Henry, because it uniquely, in some respects, displays large amounts of foliage on large vines and yet avoids the shading of the fruit. And as another advantage, Scott Henry training is mechanizable because it is so orderly in its structure on the grapevine. It is possible to mechanize dormant pruning, summer pruning, leaf removal. Here's a Palenque pruner that we have outfitted for pruning Scott Henry trained vines. If you look carefully, you'll see that we have already done the manual pruning to lay out canes on the lower fruiting wire below where the pruner is operating, and that the upper fruiting wire is being managed with a cordon and spur pruning technique, so that this mechanical pruner is starting that task, and afterwards there will be a follow-up to remove the rest of the excess growth on the upper fruiting wire along that cordon. But Scott Henry, once again, is very mechanizable. Here's another picture in another vineyard in winter showing the Palenque pruner about to prune off much of the upper growth of the Scott Henry training system. And not only does it accomplish pruning well and efficiently, but one of the major advantages of this particular pruning device is that it cuts the canes into about 3-inch lengths, and they drop to the ground. And this is a huge labor savings with regard to the brush pulling part of the pruning process. Here's another example of mechanization of vines trained with Scott Henry training system. This is a collared summer pruner about to go down this row and to do summer pruning on these large vines, and this is quite compatible with the Scott Henry training system. Well, a sixth advantage of Scott Henry training is that it's compatible with canopy management practices, some of those that we've already been talking about, like leaf removal, shoe positioning, and summer pruning. Here's a schematic showing Scott Henry training with one of its many variations of training system that we'll talk about in a little bit here. But for now, we'll look at this and say that either manually or mechanically, leaf removal is quite possible with Scott Henry training. There, doesn't that look nice? Well, we can not only do that schematically, but we can also do it in reality in the vineyard when we utilize Scott Henry training. Here it is. Well exposed fruit with still an abundance of leaf area. Well, before we leave the topic of leaf removal and Scott Henry training, I just want to say that when you're doing it manually, it is a bit of a challenge to get all the leaves off in the fruit zone, and there can be a tendency at times to do a partial leaf removal, something like this, and that's really not what we desire. And even more so when we think of the leaf removal on the lower fruiting wire of the Scott Henry training system. Most of the clusters visible here are on the upper fruiting wire, and you can just get a glimpse of the clusters on the lower fruiting wire, and a lot of the leaves on that lower fruiting wire have not really been adequately removed to get good leaf removal. So we need to be thoroughly attentive in leaf removal when we're doing it all manually. Well, when it comes to summer pruning, this is a picture in Scott Henry's vineyard on that August day in 1994, and I've put an arrow here to show where he had stopped pruning with a pruning knife when I arrived, and he hosted me and showed me what he was doing. But you can see right about where the arrow is that the overall size of these Gewürzvines is much larger, and he was doing it with a pruning knife, like I'll show you right now. Here it is. This is a knife with about a 16-inch blade, about an 8-inch handle for an overall length of about 2 feet. It's very lightweight, but it is a lot of work when you're pruning with this instrument over lots and lots of acres. Well, that's how we did summer pruning with the Scott Henry training in the early years of our work with this training system. And here's Brian looking up at the challenge of pruning these vigorous Riesling vines at our Northwest station. And you can see the row on the right has already been summer pruned and looks nice. And he actually has in his right hand, but you can't see it, that long pruning knife, and is about to summer prune the row on the left. Well, as the years went on, we did upgrade our summer pruning from the manual approach with a knife to this collared pruner, which does a wonderful job, and it really saved a lot of time in the vineyard. Notice when we go down the row here, we are using tractors that have guards on the wheels because there's so much growth down low. We would be pulling a lot of shoots off the vines with those tires if they were not protected with fenders like this. We'll have more to say about that. Here's another picture of that collared pruner as it's heading down a row to begin the summer pruning process, and you can see how nicely it does cut over the top and along sides of the vines. It's really a wonderful unit and saves a lot of manual work with the pruning knife. When it comes to the shoot positioning of vines trained to Scott Henry, it's a bit more challenging than several other training systems because we're shoot positioning both upwards and downwards, and the downward shoot positioning can be quite challenging. We have this picture showing that at about this time of growth in the vineyard, there's an opportunity to rotate the lower fruiting wire, canes on the lower fruiting wire, downward, and to do it all in one motion. And I put this picture in because all the shoots want to grow up, and when they get to the point where they're starting to encroach from the bottom fruiting wire into the upper fruiting wire, there's enough weight on these shoots so that if we rotate the whole cane on the lower fruiting wire, all the shoots will then turn over and face downwards. Here's a bit more of what we're trying to say. That is the cane. We turn that over and freed up the shoots from this lower fruiting wire, and the weight of those shoots allowed the entire cane to rotate around that fruiting wire and point downward. We make a gentle wrap of that cane on the wire, and we tie it only on the end. You can see the twine tie here. And if that's done properly at the right timing, it can really help the shoot positioning process for the downward side of the shoot positioning on the lower fruiting wire. Well, yet another advantage of Scott Henry training is that it can result in larger yields of quality fruit. We're typically already dealing with large vines with large fruiting capacity that can hold large crops, and because we can display lots of canopy, leaf area that is, up and down on the trellis, we can convert those large vines into larger yields. Here's a photo of Cabernet Franc along the top fruiting wire of Scott Henry trained vines, and you can see the abundance of fruit here. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a couple minutes. But because we can manage more shoots per foot of row, more shoots per acre with Scott Henry training than with some of the more conventional training systems, we can conceive to convert more of that large vine capacity into a somewhat larger yield. And an eighth advantage of Scott Henry training is that it results in easy hand harvesting. Here's Arturo harvesting Merlot on Scott Henry trained vines. And he's really happy about this because he can see that it's easy to pick this fruit. He can pick a lot of it in an hour. And Arturo and his whole crew knows that they are going to make good wages this day because they are picking a lot of fruit fairly rapidly to make good money in the vineyard on these Scott Henry trained vines. Well, yes, there are disadvantages to Scott Henry training. And the first one is that it requires some long cane pruning for best performance. It is true that sometimes we can have portions of the vine on a cordon with spur pruning, but for the best performance of the lower fruiting wire, we're typically going to prune that with long cane pruning, and that means there's more work to Scott Henry than a system that has all cordon and spur pruning. And we've already mentioned about the shoot positioning and that it's more complicated than with several other training systems, so that's another disadvantage. Once again, we're looking at this picture of the lower fruiting wire, and we're seeing that the cane has been rotated and the shoots are pointing down. Well, there's some issues with that regarding the equipment and the foliage as it hangs down in the path of the tractor. Here we look back at a slide that we looked at the start of this presentation, showing how the shoots and now canes are positioned quite vertically upwards and downwards, and that downward positioning into a strict vertical orientation takes a lot of work, and sometimes there's catch wires used. If you look carefully, you can see that below the lower fruiting wire there is a catch wire at about 20 inches off the ground, and we use that to tuck the shoots in to get them strictly vertically oriented on the lower part of the trellis. Well, here is a schematic of the Smart Dyson training system, and I put it in here to show you that the Smart Dyson training system utilizes on its lower shoots from the cordon what has been called a ballerina system, where the shoots are not oriented strictly vertical but hang out into the vineyard rows as shown in that end view of the schematic on the right. And if you can picture a ballerina and that her ballerina dress is flared out, that's how this aspect of this training system gets its name, Smart Dyson Ballerina. Well, we decided to utilize that with Scott Henry, and here's what it looks like. We're going down a vineyard of Cabernet Franc, and as we go down, for one, notice that when we're placing the fruit on the trellis that we're predominantly putting most of that fruit, the majority of it, 2/3 of it, on the upper fruiting wire. But the purpose of this video is to show you that the orientation of the shoots from the lower fruiting wire are not strictly vertical. They're flared out into the row some and allowed to intercept the sunlight better. Now look at it right there. Can you see that ballerina? Yes, that's what we're trying to achieve with this approach to Scott Henry. And that means, once again, that it's important to have equipment that when it goes down the row will not rip and tear those shoots when they're hanging out on the row. Here's, once again, a tractor with tires that are guarded with fenders. Very important if you're going to use this approach to the training of Scott Henry vines. Well, we're traveling down a row of Chardonnay utilizing Scott Henry training, and we're trying to show you that in the front of the tractor we have a PVC tubing that is in the form of a cow catcher, like on an old locomotive, pushing the chutes aside. And we hope you can get a glimpse of that in action so that the chutes do not get caught by the tires but are pushed aside. We're going to play a portion of that video again, but in slow motion, So you can look down between the hood of the tractor and the arm of the bucket loader and see that we are pushing chutes aside with what I called the cow catcher. It's a pile of PVC tubing glued together, and it looks sort of like the cow catcher on an old steam locomotive. And you can see the chutes being pushed aside rather than being run over by the tires of the tractor. This cow catcher is fastened with bungee cords so that if it hits something solid, for whatever reason, a post of the vineyard, it will give and it will essentially climb up on the hood of the tractor without doing damage to the vines or the cow catcher itself. So there you can see it in action. And if you're going to get into big vines with stuff positioned down near the ground with Scott Henry, you're going to want to have some way to push chutes aside and not get them in the way of the tractor tires. Okay, number 3. The disadvantage of Scott Henry is that it's not suitable when there is frequent winter injury to trunks or cordons. Here's a picture of a Riesling vineyard in the Traverse City area of Michigan after a severe winter when temperatures plummeted to minus 16. And fortunately, there was about 16 inches of snow on the ground, so you can see that most of the growth is coming up from the area under the snow. And if this were to happen with regularity, it wouldn't make sense to train vines to the complicated structure of Scott Henry. These are Scott Henry trained vines, and it turns out we reestablished the Scott Henry training system on these vines, and they have performed well for more than a decade after this episode. But if winter injury is frequent for you in your vineyard with the variety you've chosen, Scott Henry is not the choice for a training system. You'll want to look into the fan training system, which will be in our next video. Okay, number 4. The Scott Henry training system does require a taller than normal trellis for best performance, and that is extra work. Here is our picture again of dormant Riesling vines with Scott Henry training, and if you look on the left or the right on the trellis posts, on the line posts, you'll see a 2x2 extension that rises about 2 feet higher than the 6-foot post for a total of about 8 feet. Those are actually 2x4s ripped in two and then cut in half so that we have 4-foot pieces of 2x2 placed 2 foot overlapping on the trellis post so it extends up 2 feet, and then we have catch wire. So that's one possible arrangement. Another arrangement we have used is to use 3/4 inch electrical conduit, about 40-inch lengths of those, and we've put those on with clamps, and they're actually capable of being telescoped up and down. We've never done it, but we've done this so that we could get over this vineyard with a mechanical harvester if necessary. Here's a close-up of one of those extensions, and we can see that it is pinned in place with a 4-inch pole barn nail right there. And if we pull that nail out of the hole, we can pull that extension down and then replace it in another hole lower on the trellis, so we get down to about a 7-foot trellis, and then a mechanical harvester could go over the vineyard and harvest the grapes mechanically. You can see here in this picture also that we have young vines with young cordons established in both directions. Actually, these are just 1-year-old cordons, if you will, that could be spurred or pruned back to full canes again. And when you do all of it right, in the fall of the year after the grapes are harvested, the Scott Henry training system really does display all the canopy well on the trellis, and we do get a very nice maturation of the shoots into canes as shown here in late fall in this Chardonnay vineyard. Well, a fifth disadvantage of Scott Henry is the opportunity for overcropping. We said that adding additional crop is an advantage because we have more canopy, but there is the risk of adding too much crop, and indeed this picture here is a representation of an excess crop level. So when growing vines with Scott Henry, you will get fruitful buds in the renewal zone because it's very open to sunlight with the shoot positioning and leaf removal. There will be a tendency to get excessive fruitfulness and excessive crop in the Scott Henry training system, and you'll have to be aware of that and adjust your crop level when necessary. A sixth disadvantage is that a fruit quality difference does exist between the upper and lower fruiting zones. With apologies for this out of focus photo, I put this in because it is quite apparent here at the time of veraison with these Cabernet Franc vines that the fruit on the lower fruiting wire down low is maturing at a slower rate than that on the upper fruiting wire. And research has shown this to be the case. So there will be a modest difference. We do advocate that you put the majority of crop, 2/3 to 3/4, on the upper fruiting wire. And the difference isn't so very great that we can typically accept this difference and still produce overall a high quality crop. Here we can see a representation of putting the majority of the crop on the top fruiting wire and a fourth of it or so on the lower fruiting wire. Numerous variations have been devised for training vines to Scott Henry training. Some of the possibilities are the following. Here is one possibility for establishing Scott Henry training. To use two trunks, train one trunk so that it supports the lower fruiting wire, and the other trunk supports the upper fruiting wire, and one cane or cordon would go to the left, one to the right, and I've sometimes called this the Egyptian method. Just looks like something that should be on a wall in ancient Egypt. The disadvantage of this system is that you do have to have a fairly long cane at times when doing cane pruning. And if you were to have 6-foot spacings of vines, you'd have to have a 6-foot cane extending out. Sometimes in some locations you don't get that kind of growth and you can't get a cane fully extended to the next vine, and it becomes difficult to fully fill the trellis with this system. This is the up and down technique, and I believe that Scott Henry himself originally utilized Scott Henry with this system, where you have alternating vines, where one vine services the upper fruiting wire and the next vine the lower fruiting wire, and so on. My limited experience with this has not been good because we tend to get a major difference in the overall vine size and vigor and performance of these vines as time goes on. The vines that are on the upper fruiting mower tend to stay large, be highly productive, and the ones that are forced to exist only on the lower fruiting mower with downward shoot positioning tend to become stunted and small and not as healthy as the other vines. So because of a lack of uniformity of vine size and vine health, I do not favor utilizing this approach to Scott Henry training. Here we have a third option for Scott Henry training, where we have two trunks. Each trunk services a lower and upper fruiting mower in one direction, and the other trunk services the other side of the vine space, and each vine services its own vine space only. I like this. I like this because it maintains a uniformity of vine size and vine health, which is always helpful in the vineyard when you can have uniformity in the way you're going to manage vines. Notice there are spurs for renewing. We generally would say that regardless of the vine training system that you would utilize, or the architecture, if you will, the upper portion of the Scott Henry system, that is the upper fruiting mower, may be managed with cordon training and spur pruning, but the lower fruiting mower really doesn't lend itself to a cordon and spur pruning long term. It will work for a year or two, perhaps, depending upon your situation. But you're better off having, if you're going to use cordons at all, use them on the upper fruiting mower and use long cane pruning on the lower pruning mower. As an example of that type of architecture for Scott Henry training, notice once again in this picture of the mechanical pruning that the lower fruiting mower with long canes has already been established with manual pruning, and that we are in the process of filling the upper fruiting mower with a spur prune cordon after we first mechanically prune and then follow up with hand pruning to establish that cordon. Well, then a variation of what we just saw is to use 4 trunks instead of 2 to establish Scott Henry training with each vine within its own vine space, but each trunk is utilizing just 1/2 of the vine space in each direction for each fruiting mower. And it looks something like this. Here is that 4-trunk system in practice. You can see in the background vines showing at least 3 to 4 trunks. And in the foreground, we have pruned out one part of the cordon on this vine from an old trunk, and we are about to replace it with a new piece of cordon, and that's the renewal cane that is pointed out with the red arrow. So when you have multiple trunks like this, it is more work, but you can keep things alive and healthier better on a vine because you can replace portions of the vine at a time and let the other portion maintain the bulk of production in that year. Well, in summary, let's review the attributes of the Scott Henry training system. Under advantages, number 1, suitable for large vines. Yes, indeed, this is probably the best training system for managing large vines. And yes, let's go back to a picture once again of the Umpqua Valley, where Scott Henry Training was born with Mr. Scott Henry. And necessity, as they say, the mother of invention. Here, this elegant training system was invented for the purpose of managing large vines. And yes, indeed, here is a vineyard with large, vigorous vines in Michigan. And here it is, only halfway through June, and this 8-foot trellis is just full of growth. This is a perfect candidate for Scott Henry Training. Moving on, the advantages also include that it creates a divided canopy without the complexity of a three-dimensional trellis, that it can display a large canopy without shading the fruit, that it's mechanizable in several ways, that it's compatible with canopy management practices, that it promotes vine balance with large vines because you can put more shoots per foot of row and still not get excess shoot density. It can result in larger yields of quality fruit. It's easy for hand harvesting because the fruit is placed right at hand level. Well, yes, several disadvantages also. It requires some long cane pruning for best performance. That's extra work compared to spur pruning a cordon every year. And shoot positioning is more complicated than with several other training systems. And it's not suitable where there is frequent winter injury to trunks or cordons. And Scott Henry requires a taller than normal trellis for best performance, so more engineering of the trellis required. Number 5, there's opportunity for overcropping, yes indeed, because of how highly fruitful the nodes become when they're well exposed, as is the case with this training system. And there is a fruit quality difference between the upper and lower fruiting zones, and that should be taken into account by fruiting most of the crop on the upper fruiting molar. Well, that's it, folks. Scott Henry is a very, very good training system when used for large vines under the right conditions, and we spent a lot of time on it, so we hope this is helpful to you, and we hope that you have good grape growing. In our next video, we'll talk about the fan training system, which has an entirely different purpose than Scott Henry training. Till then, happy grape growing.